Watch the Middle Eastern tourist filming himself in St. Peter's Square. His name is Isa. He's live-streaming mockery of Christianity to thousands online. Then his phone explodes in his pocket. Clear skies above, but rain falls only on him.
My name is Isa. I'm 28 years old. On October 8th, 2023, I traveled to Vatican City with one mission: to create viral content mocking Christianity. I was a devout Muslim with 50,000 social media followers who trusted my religious commentary. That day changed everything I believed about God. I was raised in a household where Islam wasn't just a religion, it was our entire identity. My father would wake us before dawn for Fajr prayer, and throughout my childhood, every meal, every conversation, every decision was filtered through Islamic teachings. But there was something else that defined our family dynamic, something that shaped my worldview in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. We were taught that Christianity was a corrupted version of the truth, that Jesus was indeed a prophet, but that Christians had twisted his message beyond recognition. My father would sit us down after evening prayers and explain how the Bible had been changed over centuries, how the concept of the Trinity was an invention of men, not a revelation from God. He would point to the wealth of the Vatican, the elaborate ceremonies, the golden chalices and ornate buildings, as evidence of how far Christianity had strayed from its pure origins. Look at how they live, he would say, while their own book tells them to give to the poor and live humbly. These conversations weren't filled with hatred, but rather with what my father genuinely believed was protective love. He was trying to shield us from what he saw as spiritual deception. As I grew older and gained access to the internet, this protective instinct transformed into something more active. I started a social media account dedicated to what I called religious truth. At first, my content was purely educational about Islam, sharing verses from the Quran, explaining prayer times, discussing the beauty of Islamic architecture and culture. But gradually, as my following grew, I began to include comparative religious content. I would post side-by-side comparisons of Islamic and Christian teachings, always concluding that Islam was the more logical, more pure path. The engagement was intoxicating. Every post comparing Islamic monotheism to Christian Trinity doctrine would generate hundreds of comments, shares, and new followers. Muslims from around the world would comment with fire emojis and praise Allah that someone was finally speaking truth. But what really fueled my passion was the pushback from Christians, their defensive comments, their attempts to explain their beliefs, only confirmed in my mind that they were trying to defend the indefensible. I wasn't being cruel or hateful. I genuinely believed I was helping people see through centuries of religious manipulation. By the time I reached 50,000 followers, I had become something of a minor celebrity in certain online Islamic communities. Young Muslims would send me private messages thanking me for helping them understand their faith better, for giving them ammunition when their Christian friends or co-workers tried to evangelize to them. Older Muslims would share my posts with pride, happy to see the next generation defending Islam so eloquently. The responsibility felt enormous and thrilling at the same time. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a question began to form. If Christianity was so obviously flawed, so clearly corrupted, why did it have such a powerful hold on billions of people? Why did some of the most intelligent, educated people I knew online identify as Christians? I told myself it was cultural conditioning, generational brainwashing, but the question lingered, and that question eventually gave birth to what I thought was a brilliant idea. What if I went to the very heart of Christianity and documented its contradictions firsthand? What if I could stand in St. Peter's Square, surrounded by the opulence and pageantry of Catholicism, and show my followers exactly what I had been talking about all these years? The Vatican represented everything I believed was wrong with Christianity. The wealth, the elaborate rituals, the worship of what I saw as created things rather than the Creator himself. If I could live stream from there, showing the disconnect between Jesus' teachings about poverty and humility and the golden grandeur surrounding me, it would be the ultimate proof of my point. I started saving money immediately. Every spare dollar from my job went into what I privately called my Vatican fund. I researched the best times to visit for maximum tourist crowds, studied the layout of St. Peter's Square, even practiced my talking points in front of my bathroom mirror. I wanted this to be perfect, professional, undeniably compelling. I upgraded my phone plan to handle international streaming, bought portable battery packs, tested my camera equipment obsessively. My followers knew something big was coming. I had been posting teaser content for weeks, talking about an upcoming project that would expose the heart of Christian deception. The anticipation in the comments was building, with people guessing where I might be going, what I might be planning. Some suggested I visit mega churches in America, others recommended confronting street preachers, or filming at Christian universities. But I kept my real destination secret, wanting the reveal to be as impactful as possible. The months of preparation weren't just about logistics, they were about spiritual preparation too. I increased my daily prayers, spent extra time reading the Quran, fasted voluntarily on several occasions to purify my intentions. I wanted to make sure that what I was doing was truly for the sake of Allah, not for personal fame or ego. I convinced myself that traveling thousands of miles to mock Christianity in its headquarters was actually a form of worship, a way of defending the true faith against falsehood. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been so convinced of your own righteousness that you couldn't see the pride driving your actions? That was me. I was about to travel across the world, spend my life savings, and dedicate weeks of my life to standing in front of a church and telling people they were wrong about God. And I thought this made me humble, made me faithful, made me a good Muslim. The irony is staggering to me now, but at the time, I felt like I was embarking on a holy mission. The flight to Rome felt like the longest journey of my life, but not because of the duration. Every mile that passed beneath that plane brought me closer to what I believed would be my greatest triumph as a defender of Islamic truth. I had my talking points memorized, my equipment checked and double-checked, and my heart filled with what I thought was righteous purpose. But as we began our descent into Leonardo da Vinci Airport, something unexpected happened. I felt nervous, not excited, not the good kind of nervous you feel before a performance, but something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. The train ride from the airport into central Rome should have been my final preparation time, but instead I found myself staring out the window at the ancient architecture, the countless churches dotting the landscape, the crosses visible on building after building. I had expected to feel disgusted or angry, but what I actually felt was something closer to awe. The sheer age of these structures, the dedication it must have taken to build them, the generations of people who had found meaning within their walls. I shook my head, reminding myself that beautiful buildings didn't make false doctrine true, that Satan himself could appear as an angel of light. When I first emerged from the metro station near Vatican City, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. St. Peter's Basilica rose before me like nothing I had ever seen in person. I had studied photos, watched documentaries, seen it in movies, but standing there in the flesh, neck craned back to take in the massive dome, I felt something stir in my chest that I didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't just impressive architecture, though it certainly was that. It was something else, something that seemed to reach past my intellectual defenses and touch a place in my soul I didn't know existed. I forced myself to focus on my mission. I pulled out my phone and started recording immediately, but my first attempts were shaky and unfocused. "Here I am at Vatican City," I began, but my voice sounded different somehow, less confident than in all my practice sessions. I deleted that video and tried again, this time focusing my camera on what I saw as the problematic elements. The Swiss guards in their elaborate uniforms, the tourists snapping photos instead of praying, the vendors selling religious trinkets outside what was supposed to be sacred space. But as I continued filming, walking through St. Peter's Square, something strange was happening to my narrative. The tourists I was trying to portray as mindless, consumers of false religion, didn't look mindless at all. Many were clearly moved by what they were seeing. Some were praying quietly. Others were helping elderly visitors navigate the crowds. Families were taking photos not out of superficiality, but to capture what was obviously a meaningful moment in their lives. The Swiss guards, rather than looking like symbols of worldly power, appeared to be taking their protective duties seriously, treating visitors with respect and dignity. I decided to go live, hoping that the energy of real-time interaction with my followers would help me regain my focus and purpose. Within minutes, hundreds of viewers had joined the stream, and the comments began flowing. Show them the truth, brother. Expose the idol worship. May Allah guide you and protect you. The familiar encouragement from my online community helped restore some of my confidence, and I began to find my rhythm. Look at this place, I said to my phone camera, making sure to capture both my face and the basilica behind me. Look at how they've turned what should be simple worship into this massive display of wealth and power. The comments exploded with fire emojis and praise. You see these tourists taking pictures like this is Disneyland instead of a place of worship? This is what happens when you lose sight of true monotheism, when you start worshipping creation instead of Creator. The engagement was everything I had hoped for and more. My viewer count kept climbing, and I could see my followers sharing the stream in real time. Muslims from different countries were tuning in, and I even noticed some Christian viewers joining, probably to argue in the comments. This was exactly the kind of reach I had dreamed of when I first conceived this plan. I pointed my camera at the massive cross atop St. Peter's Basilica. They've forgotten that Jesus, peace be upon him, was just a prophet, just a messenger like Moses, like Muhammad, peace be upon them all. But look at what they've done. They've made him into God himself. They worship the creation instead of the Creator. The comments were flowing faster than I could read them now, a mixture of encouragement from Muslims and angry rebuttals from Christians who had stumbled onto my stream. Emboldened by the response, I became more direct, more confrontational in my delivery. I walked closer to the basilica, making sure my camera captured every detail of what I saw as excessive ornamentation. This building cost millions, probably billions over the centuries. How many poor people could have been fed with that money? How many orphans could have been housed? Yet they built this monument to themselves, this temple to false doctrine, while people starved in the streets. The irony of my words wouldn't hit me until much later. Here I was, someone who had spent his life savings to travel across the world for the purpose of making viral content, criticizing others for their priorities and expenditures, but in that moment, surrounded by the energy of my growing audience, feeling like I was fulfilling my destiny as a defender of truth, I felt nothing but righteous indignation. I continued my commentary, walking through the square, pointing out everything that confirmed my preconceived notions while ignoring anything that might complicate my narrative. When I saw people praying quietly, I focused instead on those taking selfies. When I noticed the beautiful artwork that clearly took incredible skill and devotion to create, I talked instead about how much money could have been spent on the poor. My followers were eating it up, sharing the stream, inviting their friends to watch, creating exactly the kind of viral moment I had hoped for. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so committed to being right that you became blind to everything that might prove you wrong? That was me, standing in one of the most spiritually significant places in the Christian world, surrounded by centuries of faith and devotion and sacrifice, and seeing only what I wanted to see. I was about to learn that God has a way of getting our attention, especially when we're working so hard not to listen. The live stream had been going for almost an hour and I was hitting my stride. My viewer count had reached over 2,000 people, the highest I had ever achieved in real time. Comments were flying by so fast I could barely read them, but the overwhelming sentiment was exactly what I had hoped for. Mashallah, brother, keep speaking truth. This is exactly what we needed to see. May Allah reward you for exposing this. The validation was intoxicating, and I felt like I was fulfilling my purpose as a defender of true monotheism. I had positioned myself directly in the center of St. Peter's Square, making sure the massive basilica dominated the background of my video. The symbolism was perfect. Here I was, a faithful Muslim, standing at the very heart of what I saw as Christian deception, boldly proclaiming the truth of Islam to thousands of viewers around the world. Every few minutes I would turn the camera to show the crowds of tourists, the ornate architecture, the Swiss guards, using each element as evidence for my arguments about the corruption of Christianity. "You see this cross up there?" I said, pointing my phone camera toward the top of the basilica dome. "This is where they've gotten everything wrong. They take a man, a prophet that Allah sent to guide the children of Israel, and they make him into God himself. They worship the creation instead of the Creator." The response in the comments was immediate and enthusiastic. Heart emojis, fire emojis, people tagging their friends to watch, sharing the stream to their own social media accounts. The energy was building to what I felt would be my most powerful moment. I had been saving my strongest arguments for when my audience was at its peak, and this felt like the perfect time. I took a deep breath, looked directly into my phone camera, and prepared to deliver what I thought would be the climax of my entire presentation. "Look around at all this wealth, all this gold, all these elaborate ceremonies," I began, my voice growing more confident and forceful. "Jesus himself said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. Yet look at this place. Look at how they live. They've built themselves palaces while claiming to follow someone who owned nothing, who told his followers to sell everything and give to the poor." The comments were exploding with agreement, and I could see my viewer count continuing to climb. This was exactly the kind of content that would go viral, exactly the kind of impact I had dreamed of making. I felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing that I was about to deliver my final, most devastating critique of Christian theology, but then something started to feel wrong. At first I thought it was just the excitement, the rush of adrenaline from performing in front of such a large live audience. My phone felt warm in my hand, which wasn't unusual during long streaming sessions. The device had been working hard for over an hour, processing video, managing the live chat, maintaining the internet connection. I had experienced phone overheating before, though never quite to this degree. The warmth quickly intensified into something that could only be described as heat. Not the gentle warmth of a device working hard, but actual heat, the kind you feel when you accidentally touch something you shouldn't. I shifted the phone from one hand to the other, trying to continue my commentary while managing the discomfort. My thousands of viewers had no idea anything was wrong. To them, I was simply continuing my passionate defense of Islamic truth against Christian falsehood. They claimed that Jesus died for their sins. I continued, trying to ignore the growing heat radiating from my device. But Allah tells us clearly in the Quran that it only appeared that he was crucified. They've built their entire religion on a lie, and then they wonder why their doctrine makes no sense. The irony of my situation was lost on me at the time. Here I was, talking about things not being what they appeared to be, while my phone was literally heating up beyond any normal parameters. The heat was becoming impossible to ignore. I could feel it through my pocket now, a burning sensation against my leg that was growing more intense by the second. I tried to casually move the phone away from my body while continuing to stream, but the heat seemed to be increasing exponentially. This wasn't the gradual warming of an overworked device. This was something else entirely, something that defied my understanding of how phones were supposed to behave. I attempted to wrap up my stream quickly, thinking I could end the broadcast and deal with whatever technical problem was occurring. "So what we see here at Vatican City," I said, trying to maintain my composure while the burning sensation against my leg became almost unbearable, "is the perfect example of how far Christianity has strayed from the original message that Allah sent through Jesus, peace be upon him." But as I spoke those words, as I stood there in St. Peter's Square, surrounded by thousands of pilgrims and tourists, declaring that Jesus was nothing more than a prophet, while my phone burned against my body, something happened that I will never forget as long as I live. The heat suddenly intensified beyond anything I could have imagined. It went from uncomfortable to painful to excruciating in the span of perhaps 2 seconds, and then, while I was still live on camera, while thousands of people were still watching my stream, while I was mid-sentence explaining why Christians were wrong about Jesus, my phone exploded. Not metaphorically, not a battery failure that caused it to shut down or restart. An actual explosion. Flames shot out of my pocket, visible flames that I could see, and that the tourists around me could see. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I dropped to the ground instantly screaming, not caring about my audience or my message or anything except getting this burning device away from my body. I was rolling on the stone pavement of St. Peter's Square, frantically trying to remove my phone from my pocket while actual flames were visible rising from the fabric. The tourists around me had stopped their sightseeing and were staring in shock and horror. Some were reaching for their own phones to call for help. Others were backing away, unsure whether I might be dangerous or whether this was some kind of terrorist attack. Through the pain and panic, one thought kept repeating in my mind. This was impossible. Phones don't just explode. Devices don't spontaneously combust while you're using them normally. There had been no warning signs, no previous problems, no reason for this to happen. Yet here I was, writhing on the ground in front of St. Peter's Basilica, my leg burning from an explosion that should not have been possible. Ask yourself this question. What goes through your mind when the impossible becomes undeniably real? When everything you understand about how the world works suddenly doesn't apply to your situation? That was me, lying on ancient stones, surrounded by smoke from my own device, trying to process what had just happened while dealing with pain, unlike anything I had ever imagined. The pain from the burns on my leg was excruciating, but what happened next defied every law of physics and weather I had ever learned. As I lay there on the stone pavement of St. Peter's Square, smoke still rising from my destroyed phone, writhing in agony and trying to process what had just occurred, I felt the first drops of water on my face. At first I thought someone was trying to help me, maybe pouring water from a bottle to cool the burns, but as I looked up through my tears of pain, I saw something that made absolutely no sense. The sky directly above me was the same brilliant blue it had been all day, not a cloud visible anywhere. The sun was shining brightly, casting sharp shadows across the square. Yet water was falling on me, gentle drops that felt impossibly warm and soothing against my burned skin. I blinked hard, thinking the pain was causing hallucinations, but the water kept falling, and as I turned my head to look around, I realized something that made my mind reel. The rain was falling only on me, not on the tourists standing just a few feet away, not on the Swiss guards who had started moving in my direction, not on any part of the vast square except for the small area where I lay. The ground around me was becoming wet, but everywhere else remained completely dry. A family of tourists about 10 feet away stood watching in amazement, their clothes and hair completely dry under the bright sunshine. The woman was pointing at me, saying something to her husband in what sounded like German, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. A group of teenagers had their phones out, not to mock or ridicule, but filming something they clearly couldn't understand. Everyone in the immediate area had stopped what they were doing to stare at this impossible scene. The rain wasn't heavy or violent. It fell gently, almost tenderly, each drop seeming to know exactly where it needed to go. As the warm water touched the burned areas on my leg, the pain began to subside in a way that made no medical sense. Burns don't heal from water. Cool water can provide temporary relief, but what I was experiencing was beyond relief. It was as if the damage was actually being reversed, as if my skin was being restored to its condition before the explosion. I tried to stand up, partly to escape this impossible situation and partly to see if I could somehow get out of the rain that couldn't exist. But as I moved, the rain moved with me, not in a way that suggested the weather pattern was following me, but rather as if there was some kind of invisible cloud positioned directly above my body, raining only on the space I occupied. When I shifted left, the rain shifted left. When I moved right, it followed. The dry ground and dry people around me remained completely unaffected. The tourists were no longer just watching. Some were pulling out phones to record what they were seeing. Others were calling to friends and family members nearby to come witness something they knew no one would believe. I could hear fragments of conversation in multiple languages, people trying to explain to others what they were looking at. È impossibile, an Italian man was saying to his wife. Das ist unmöglich, the German woman kept repeating. This is impossible, an American couple was telling each other. But here's what struck me most profoundly. My phone had exploded while I was mocking Jesus, while I was standing in front of the most significant church in Christianity, declaring that their beliefs about him were false, and instead of punishment, instead of some kind of divine retribution that I probably deserved, I was experiencing what could only be described as healing. The impossible rain was warm, gentle, restorative. It wasn't angry or violent. It was merciful. I looked up at the clear blue sky again, trying to find any rational explanation for what was happening. Meteorologically, this was beyond impossible. Rain requires clouds, atmospheric pressure changes, weather systems. You don't get precipitation from cloudless skies, and you certainly don't get localized precipitation that follows a person around while leaving everything else dry. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Water was falling from a clear sky onto me and me alone. As the minutes passed, more people gathered to watch. I could see Swiss guards speaking into radios, probably reporting the situation to their superiors. Vatican security personnel were approaching carefully, not with aggression, but with the cautious concern you might show towards someone experiencing a medical emergency. None of them seemed to know how to handle a situation where someone was being rained on under cloudless skies. The burns on my leg continued to feel better, not just relieved, but actually healed. I pulled up my pant leg to look, and what I saw made me gasp. The skin that had been red and blistered just minutes before was now pink and healthy. Not perfect, but far better than it should have been. The fabric of my pants that had been singed by the phone explosion was still damaged, but my skin underneath looked like it had been healing for days rather than minutes. Through all of this, one thought kept pounding in my mind. I had been wrong. Not just about phones or weather or physics, but about something much more fundamental. I had traveled thousands of miles to mock Jesus, to prove that Christians were deceived about who he was. And at the moment of my greatest boldness, when I was declaring most forcefully that he was nothing more than a prophet, something impossible had happened. My device had exploded, causing me real harm, and then something or someone had intervened to heal that harm in a way that defied natural law. The crowd around me was growing larger, but they maintained a respectful distance. Some were praying quietly, others were simply staring in awe. I noticed several people making the sign of the cross, and for the first time in my life, that gesture didn't seem like superstition or idol worship. It seemed like recognition, like acknowledgement of something holy happening in their presence. Ask yourself this question. If you were absolutely convinced that someone was just a man, just a prophet, just a teacher from long ago, and then you experienced something that suggested he might actually be much more than that, how would you respond? Would you cling to your certainty, or would you allow the possibility that you might have been wrong about something fundamental? The impossible rain continued to fall only on me, warm and healing and gentle, while the Mediterranean sun shone brightly on everyone else in St. Peter's Square. As the impossible rain continued to fall only on me in that sunny square, I became aware of someone approaching through the crowd of stunned onlookers. A man in black robes was making his way toward me, and I could see from his collar that he was a Catholic priest. My first instinct was panic. Here I was, a Muslim who had just been live-streaming anti-Christian content to thousands of people, now sitting in a puddle of miraculous water in front of the most important church in Christianity. I expected anger, confrontation, maybe even accusations that I had somehow staged this entire spectacle. Instead, this priest simply knelt down beside me on the wet stones, completely unconcerned that his robes were getting soaked from the water that was still falling exclusively on my location. His face showed nothing but genuine concern and compassion. "Are you hurt?" he asked in accented English, looking at my leg where my pants were still singed from the phone explosion. "Do you need medical attention?" I stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. This man had no idea who I was, or what I had been doing just minutes before my phone exploded. He didn't know about my social media following or my mission to mock his faith. All he saw was someone who appeared to be in distress, and his immediate response was to help. "I don't understand what's happening," I finally managed to say, gesturing at the rain that was still falling on us both while the rest of the square remained dry. "My name is Father Antonio," he said gently. "I was inside the basilica when I heard there was some kind of incident out here." He looked up at the clear sky, then at the wet ground around us, then back at me. "This is certainly unusual," he said with what I can only describe as a peaceful smile. "But unusual things happen here sometimes. God works in ways we don't always expect." I wanted to argue with him, to explain that this had nothing to do with his God, that there had to be a scientific explanation for what was occurring. But sitting there in that warm, impossible rain, with my burns healing in ways that defied medical logic, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself asking, "Why aren't you angry with me?" Father Antonio looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would I be angry with you? You seem to be having a difficult day, and you're clearly shaken by whatever happened with your phone. This doesn't seem like a time for anger." Something in his voice, in his complete lack of judgment or suspicion, began to break down walls inside me that I hadn't even known existed. "I was making a video," I said quietly, not sure why I was confessing this to him. "I was live streaming to my followers, talking about how Christianity is wrong, how Catholics worship idols, how Jesus was just a prophet, and not God." I waited for his expression to change, for the kindness to disappear from his eyes, for him to realize he was wasting his compassion on someone who had come here specifically to attack his beliefs. Instead, Father Antonio nodded thoughtfully. "And then your phone caught fire." "It exploded," I said, "right in my pocket while I was talking about Jesus. And then this rain started, but only on me. Look around, Father. Everyone else is completely dry. The sun is shining everywhere except right here. How is that possible?" Father Antonio was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the crowd of tourists who were still watching us with amazement, as some taking pictures, others just staring in wonder. "I don't know how it's possible," he said finally, "but I've learned over the years that God sometimes gets our attention in ways that are impossible to ignore or explain away." The weight of what he was suggesting hit me like a physical blow. "You think your God did this? You think Jesus made my phone explode and then sent rain to heal me?" Even as I spoke the words, part of me recognized how they sounded. I was sitting in miraculous healing rain that was falling from a cloudless sky, asking if it was possible that something supernatural was occurring. I think, Father Antonio said carefully, that you came here with one set of beliefs, and you're experiencing something that challenges those beliefs. That's never easy, but it's often how God works in our lives. He doesn't usually argue with us or try to win debates. He just shows us who He really is. The rain was beginning to lighten, though it continued to fall exclusively on our location. I could feel that my burns were almost completely healed now, which should have been impossible. The destroyed phone beside me was evidence that this had all really happened, that I hadn't hallucinated or imagined the explosion, and the dozens of witnesses around us were proof that the localized rain wasn't something I was experiencing alone. I've spent years teaching people that Christians are wrong about Jesus, I said to Father Antonio, my voice barely above a whisper. I have 50,000 followers who trust me to tell them the truth about religion. I came here to prove that your faith is built on lies. And what do you think now? He asked, not with triumph or smugness, but with genuine curiosity about my internal struggle. That question opened a floodgate of confusion and doubt that I had been holding back. I don't know what to think. My phone doesn't just explode for no reason. Rain doesn't fall from clear skies on one person. Burns don't heal in minutes from water. None of this should be possible, but it happened. I felt it, I lived it, and all these people saw it. Father Antonio reached into his robes and pulled out a small towel, offering it to me as the rain finally stopped completely. The sudden absence of water felt almost jarring after the gentle, warm droplets that had been falling on me for what felt like an eternity, but had probably been only 10 or 15 minutes. Sometimes, he said, God speaks to us in our own language. You came here with arguments and debates, but He responded with something that couldn't be argued or debated. He showed you something that could only be experienced. Ask yourself this question. What do you do when everything you've built your identity on suddenly seems uncertain? When the foundation of your worldview gets shaken by something you can't explain away or rationalize? I sat there in St. Peter's Square, surrounded by evidence of the impossible, talking to a priest who should have been my enemy, but was treating me with more kindness than I deserved, and I realized I had no idea who I really was anymore. The crowd around us was beginning to disperse, though many people continued to steal glances in our direction as they walked away. The stones beneath us were still wet, the only wet patch in the entire vast square, a permanent reminder of something that shouldn't have been possible, but undeniably was. That night in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the destroyed remains of my phone. The device that had been my connection to 50,000 followers, my platform for spreading what I thought was religious truth, was now nothing but melted plastic and burnt metal. The screen was completely black, the case warped from heat, the battery compartment split open from the explosion. It was physical proof that what I had experienced wasn't a dream or hallucination. I had walked back to my hotel in a daze, still feeling the phantom sensation of warm rain on my skin, despite the fact that my clothes had dried completely in the Mediterranean sun. Every few steps, I would touch the spot on my leg where the burns had been, expecting to feel pain or damage, but finding only smooth, healthy skin. Father Antonio had given me his business card before I left, along with an invitation to return to the Vatican whenever I felt ready to talk more. I had taken the card but wasn't sure I would ever use it. The silence in my hotel room was deafening. For months I had been constantly connected, constantly creating content, constantly engaged with my online community. Now, with my phone destroyed and no way to contact my followers, I was alone with my thoughts for the first time in years. And those thoughts were terrifying because they were leading me toward conclusions I had spent my entire adult life rejecting. I tried to reconstruct what had happened from a rational, scientific perspective. Phone batteries could malfunction, though the explosion I had experienced was far beyond anything I had ever heard of in technical forums or consumer reports. Weather could be unpredictable, though localized rain falling from cloudless skies on a single person violated every meteorological principle I knew. Healing could occur more quickly than expected, though my burns had improved in ways that defied medical explanation. But even as I tried to rationalize each element separately, I couldn't escape the timing. My phone had exploded at the exact moment I was declaring most boldly that Jesus was nothing more than a prophet. The healing rain had begun immediately after I was injured. The whole sequence felt intentional, purposeful, like a response rather than a series of random coincidences. I found myself remembering things Father Antonio had said, particularly his comment about God speaking to people in their own language. For years, I had been challenging Christians through videos, live streams, and social media posts. I had been demanding evidence, asking for proof, insisting that their beliefs couldn't withstand rational scrutiny. And then, when I was at the very center of Christianity making those same arguments, I had experienced something that couldn't be explained rationally, but could only be experienced personally. The question that kept haunting me was this: if Jesus really was just a prophet, just a man, just a teacher from 2,000 years ago, how could he have responded to my mockery with what I had experienced? Dead people don't perform miracles. Historical figures don't intervene in contemporary events. The only way what had happened to me made sense was if Jesus was somehow still alive, still active, still present in ways that transcended normal human existence. I pulled out the Quran I'd brought with me on this trip, thinking that returning to familiar verses might help restore my spiritual equilibrium. But as I read passages about Jesus that I had memorized years ago, they seemed different somehow. The Quran acknowledged that Jesus performed miracles, that he was born of a virgin, that he was a sign from Allah. What if these weren't just stories about a dead prophet, but descriptions of someone who was still performing miracles today? Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the warmth of that impossible rain, could see the amazed faces of the tourists who had witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. I kept thinking about the expression on Father Antonio's face when he had found me sitting in that puddle of miraculous water. He hadn't seemed shocked or surprised, just compassionate and understanding. It was as if he had seen similar things before, as if the impossible was somehow routine in his experience of faith. Around 3 a.m, I found myself on my knees beside the hotel bed. I hadn't consciously decided to pray, but somehow that's where I ended up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't facing toward Mecca. I wasn't reciting familiar Arabic phrases that I had memorized in childhood. Instead, I found myself speaking directly to the person I had traveled so far to mock. Jesus, I said quietly, feeling strange even pronouncing his name in prayer. If you're really who these people say you are, if you're really God and not just a prophet, I need help understanding what happened today. I've built my whole life around being right about religion, around knowing the truth, around teaching others, but I don't know anything anymore. The words came out in a rush, years of certainty crumbling into honest confusion and desperate need for clarity. I came here to expose what I thought were lies about you. Instead, my phone exploded and you healed me with rain that couldn't exist. I don't understand how that's possible, but I can't deny that it happened. If you're really alive, if you're really listening, help me know what to do with this. What happened next was unlike any prayer experience I had ever had. There was no voice, no vision, no dramatic supernatural manifestation. Instead, there was simply peace, a deep, profound sense of being known and accepted and loved that filled every corner of that hotel room, and every space in my heart that I hadn't even realized was empty. It was like coming home to a place I had never been, like being embraced by someone I had never met but who knew everything about me. I stayed on my knees for what felt like hours, not because I felt obligated to maintain a prayer posture, but because I didn't want this feeling to end. For the first time in my life, I felt completely at peace with not having all the answers, completely comfortable with the possibility that everything I thought I knew might be wrong. When I finally stood up, I knew that my life had fundamentally changed. I couldn't go back to my old certainties, couldn't return to teaching people that Christians were deceived about Jesus, couldn't pretend that what I had experienced was explainable through normal means. I had encountered something, someone, who had responded to my mockery with mercy, to my attacks with healing, to my arrogance with gentle correction. The next morning, I walked back to St. Peter's Square. The stones where I had experienced the impossible rain looked completely normal now, dry and weathered like the rest of the ancient pavement, but I knew what had happened there, and I knew it had changed everything. I pulled Father Antonio's card from my pocket and looked at the address for his office. It was time to learn about the Jesus I had encountered, the one who was alive enough to make phones explode and compassionate enough to heal the damage with miraculous rain. It was time to discover who this person really was that I had traveled so far to deny, but who had instead chosen to reveal himself to me in the most unexpected way possible. Look inside your own heart right now. Have you ever been so certain about something that you traveled across the world to prove it, only to discover that you were wrong in ways you never could have imagined? That was me, walking towards a priest's office to begin learning about the Jesus I had spent years rejecting, but who had just spent one impossible afternoon showing me more mercy than I had ever experienced in my life.